welcome to Feral Thinkers Podcast on streaming television with the cord cut. This is podcast number 6 for 8 July 2016. I missed a day yesterday. Sorry about that. Sometimes it's just not possible to put together a program, but I'm working on getting more material ahead so I can avoid this in the future. Tonight's program focuses exclusively on Mr. Robot and particularly on the relationship between the TV program and the movie Fight Club. There's much to say, so let's get started. I've mentioned in previous podcasts that I see a lot of similarities between Mr. Robot and Fight Club, particularly in the style and attitude of the voiceover narration. There is a strong similarity because both programs feature underground groups who attempt to overthrow the corporate overlords. And so if you look out there on the web, there is all sorts of articles bearing out my intuition that yes, there are many similarities between Mr. Robot and Fight Club. That's not a bad thing. There's plenty of room there in this area for more development. However, if you notice during the opening credits of Mr. Robot, credit is given to a production company called Anonymous Content. I looked at Anonymous Content and some of the material they have to promote productions out of their company, and I looked at the trailer that they have for Mr. Robot, which is really spectacular, and it mentions a couple of things. It credits one of the people working on Mr. Robot as the director of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. Now, it turns out that the director of the American version is David Fincher, who is the director also of Fight Club. So, I have rigorously gone through IMDb.com, Internet Movie Database, and found really no immediate connection between Fincher and Mr. Robot. The connection is there, but it's a little bit tenuous, and it's tied up with the sort of nasty, incestuous business style of Hollywood, which really doesn't interest me. They somehow miraculously managed to produce movies, some of which are interesting, and that's what I like. I don't care about the business apparatus. It's the least interesting part of it. But I do care very much that there is a connection of some sort between Mr. Robot and Fight Club, and that's what I've been tracking down. Well, alright. It turns out, first off, Anonymous Content is largely a house built by a man named Steve Golan, best known as the producer of Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind and The Revenant. He is founder and CEO of Anonymous Content LLP, a multimedia development, production, and talent management company based in Culver City, California. The company reunites Golan with such directors as David Fincher and several other names that neither one of us will recognize. Co-founded his first venture in 1986. It was called Propaganda Films, and it represented several directors, and it was co-founded by David Fincher and rising star Michael Bay. So there's some interesting connections for you. Golan is also a producer of House of Cards, which he sold to Netflix as a 2-season package complete with movie stars and director David Fincher. So in a nutshell, the only real link that I've been able to document so far is that Mr. Robot is produced by Golan, who is a sometimes business associate of David Fincher. Either Fincher or, more likely, writer Chuck Palahniuk, who penned Fight Club, uses well-defined narrative device. Consider this opening line that the narrator says at the beginning of Fight Club. With my tongue, I can feel the rifling in the barrel. For a second, I totally forget about Tyler's whole controlled demolition thing, and I wondered how clean this gun is. So you see that Tyler here is about to blow up half of downtown, but the narrator is only worried about whether the gun is clean or not. And, of course, that gun presents a very real risk. If it goes off at the wrong angle, it's going to blow his brains out. But he's worrying about whether or not it's clean. As the narrator develops his character and his fixation on yuppie fixings, he says, I would flip through catalogs and wonder, what kind of dining set defines me as a person? We used to read pornography. Now it was the Horchow collection. What these are doing is somewhat like a literary device called athos, where you establish an anticipation for something really sublime. The lyrics seem to be leading upward to some divine statement, but instead of going upwards, we get this downfall. And so that technique is called bathos. Webster defines bathos as an effect of anticlimax created by a lapse in mood, the sublime to the trivial or ridiculous. Now, this isn't exactly bathos. In a way, it's a kind of anti-bathos. But here's another example. What I'm about to tell you is top secret. A conspiracy bigger than all of us. There's a powerful group of people out there that are secretly running the world. I'm talking about the guys no one knows about. The ones that are invisible. The top 1% of the top 1%. The guys that play God without permission. And now I think they're following me. End quote. First off, that's a great piece of writing because it hooks you right in. It's from the beginning of the show, episode 1 of season 1. It also implies that we are dealing with paranoid fiction. Paranoid fiction emerged out of dystopian literature. Dystopian literature is the stuff like 1984. It's anti-utopian literature. It's literature in which the government paints itself as great and is feeding the people all sorts of propaganda to control them. Paranoid fiction, as a kind of post-dystopian literature, takes the nightmare one step further. Somehow, control has so much power that the very nature of reality itself is a lie generated by control. The most spectacular example of that is The Matrix. And that line about the 1% of the top 1%, that, of course, is from Mr. Robot. Here's one more quote from Mr. Robot that establishes the show as paranoid fiction in one very simple line. The world itself is just one big hoax. So there's tons of stuff out there about the parallels and similarities between Mr. Robot and Fight Club, but very little documentation about David Fincher's involvement with the Mr. Robot project. No matter, it's very real, and examples abound, particularly in the paranoid, almost noir actions of the night. And in fact, at the beginning, the narrator establishes that by day he is an ordinary systems programmer for a security house, but by night he's a hacker. And in other words, there's both a daytime and a noir thing. And that distinction actually is something that we saw in The Matrix, that the Keanu Reeves character has trouble holding down a day job because he can't get up early because he spends his nights doing some really deep hacking stuff. And it's that deep hacking that becomes really the most important part of his life. If you are viewing or reviewing Season 1 to be ready for the Season 2 premiere next Wednesday, you should be watching the 6th episode from the first season tonight. In my system, I call that episode 1.6, but in Mr. Robot's fun, nerdy, crazy programmer's kind of way of numbering episodes, starting with 1.0, they call this episode 1.5 RayTraveler.asf, and that's written as 1.5 VR4VE-Traveler.asf. Anyway, I'm thrilled that someone is out there continuing to explore this Fight Club branch of paranoid fiction. And meanwhile, Czech Palahniuk has been writing and publishing a sequel to Fight Club in the form of a series of graphic novel installments. There are 10 out there so far because, as the tagline for the comics says, some imaginary friends never go away. One other thing about Mr. Robot is that it has an IMDb rating of 8.8 out of 10, and Rotten Tomatoes rates it at 96%. That's only 4 percentage points away from perfect. Rotten Tomatoes rating system is a little confusing to me because I would think a big number of Rotten Tomatoes means that the audience has thrown a lot of Rotten Tomatoes at you and they hate you, but it actually works the other way around. 96% from Rotten Tomatoes is a very rare and hard to find number. That's it for today's podcast. Thanks so much for listening. You can follow this program through my blog at dmasonwest.com, or you can follow along through any of my social network presences, which are listed at feralthinker.com. This podcast is published daily with a release at 4 p.m. Central U.S. time or 2100 hours Greenwich Mean Time. Thanks